Hi, my name's Marty. Welcome to this video series on building your own LPH style guitar kit from Guitar Kit World. So in the following video I'm going to show you how I put together this particular guitar, and we're going to cover all aspects of the build, including finishing, installing hardware, connecting the electronics, and then doing a final setup at the end. Now if you've never built a kit guitar yourself before or don't have a lot of tools, don't worry, I'm not particularly handy myself, but just about anyone can put together a guitar like this using basic tools and just a little bit of patience. Okay, so the guitar we're working on today is an LP style guitar. It's a semi-hollow body. We have a mahogany body and neck, a flame maple veneer top, rosewood fretboard, and trapezoid abalone inlays. Now being an LP style guitar, we also have a neck and bridge humbucker, three-way selector switch, 2 volume and 2 tone controls, and of course a tune-o-matic bridge. Okay, so from here I'm going to take the video back to the start of the build, and we're going to start by putting the guitar up on the bench and inspecting the body for any marks or scratches. Okay, there's no real issues to address with this body. I can't see any marks or dents or glue stains or anything of that nature. Mahogany body itself, we may need to do some grain filling, but as I said, it has had a sanding sealer applied, and that may suffice. Okay, otherwise, got our humbuckers. Got 2 of these, a neck and a bridge humbucker. Our tuners. Bridge and tailpiece. And their electrical components and hardware, so pickup selector, wiring and pots for volume and tone, tone and volume knobs, input jack, guitar strings, truss rod cover, and a selection of nuts and bolts that we'll need to put the guitar together. Okay, so our first job really from here, now that we've inspected the body, is to dry fit the neck. So what I like to do is just lay the guitar on top of the polystyrofoam. When we insert the neck, be careful not to just push it straight down. We want to insert one in like this first and bring it down so that we're not chipping the edges of the neck pocket. Just check the skull length. The skull length should be 628mm, which looks exactly right. Okay, so now we've got some glue on our neck heel, and inside the neck pocket, the next thing to do is clamp the neck to the body. So we don't need to protect the top of the guitar here, but I do have a a small section of timber just underneath the body, protecting the underside of the guitar. Now I'm going to use 2 clamps here, and that will distribute the pressure from the clamps evenly. The other thing, don't be too concerned. Obviously we're trying to minimize any issues, but don't be too concerned if some glue escapes once you're tightening those clamps. We'll be inspecting the body next and cleaning and removing any glue stains from the binding and the veneer top. If we look on the side here, we can certainly see some glue marks. This is probably due to the binding being glued in place and some of that glue's gotten on the body. So first we'll try to remove that with some warm water and a rag. Failing that, we may need to do some sanding. Just trying to rub around some of those more visible areas where we can see some glue. Okay, so I've just let the guitar body dry. The warm water's actually removed some of the marks on the top here, but as we can see if we look on the side, it's been pretty ineffective removing those glue stains or glue marks around here. So what I'll do next is some light sanding. So I'm using a 240 grit sandpaper. So you can see the sandpaper's been fairly effective removing those stains around the side of the body. The glue can sometimes be a little hard to spot on the body of the guitars. So if you're not sure, spray a little bit of moisture on the body, the same way you would if you were raising the grain of the timber. And if any water's not being absorbed, it may be a sign there's some issues with glue still. So you can see I'm now sanding the veneer. Just keep in mind they're really quite thin, so you want to avoid sand throughs. And lastly, I've just got some degreaser on a rag and I'm giving the guitar a good wipe over. Okay, so next I'm just masking off the body. I'm just using some material from the packaging to put inside those F-holes just to prevent any stain dripping down onto the inside of the body of the guitar, and then I'm masking off the neck pickup cavity and the bridge pickup cavity. Then I'll mask off the fretboard. You may be wondering why I'm wearing gloves. It's a particularly hot day here. My hands are fairly sweaty, so I'm just trying to prevent any oils from my hands going on the body of the guitar itself after we've cleaned it off. Okay, so the plan with this this guitar is to give it a nice purple stain on top and a natural finish around the sides and the neck. But just looking at this grain here, it could do with a little more emphasis. So what I'm thinking of doing is applying a black first, really rubbing that in, and then sanding it away. As per usual, just take a very clean rag. I've got Japanese brown here. Really work it in as well, because we'll be removing the bulk of this when we sand. As you can see, I haven't bothered masking the binding on the body of the guitar itself. I find that's a little more time consuming and not really worth the effort. You'll often find that the stain itself will leach under the tape, so it's often easier just to scrape the binding at the end. There's certain ways to do that, which I'll show you. So just a quick clarification. You will want to inspect the binding carefully first. If you notice any cracks in the binding, you certainly will want to mask that up, as it will absorb stain. Okay, so we've just let this darker stain dry. What I'm going to do now is start removing as much as I can using some 240 grit sandpaper. The objective here is to just leave some of that darker stain to absorb into some of those grain lines, and that will accentuate the grain when we then put our purple stain over the top. Okay, so we've sanded most of that darker stain off now. Just left the sections we want, which is really going to help really make that grain pop once we put some purple on. So what I'm doing now, just going to apply a light sort of wash coat of purple. I'll probably follow this up with a stronger coat. obviously in between sanding and restaining, I've taken a lot of time to really clean the guitar up and remove any dust. So we've let our first light coat dry. I'm going to follow that up now with a stronger coat. I've just mixed this purple up a little bit stronger, so we'll see how this looks. And as you can see, where we did the first coat with the Japan brown, the grain's really starting to pop now. With a nice oil finish on top, this should look really good. I think that's just about right. So what we'll do now is let that dry overnight, and we'll come back and we'll look at grain filling the body and looking at a finish for the sides and the neck. So once completed staining, I've waited for that to dry, and then I've flipped the guitar over and I've applied 2 coats of Grainfill to the back, sides and back of the neck. Now we use a Grainfill because this is a very open grain timber, being mahogany, and if we want a level surface to work with, we need to fill the pores, those open pores on the surface of the timber. Now you can use a water-based product or an oil-based. Typically oil will penetrate further, but water is a little tidier to work with, obviously, a little easier to clean up. And when you're applying Grainfill, work with the grain first and then work against the grain. Apply it with a rag and really force it into the grain. So from here, I'm just sanding away that grain filler now. I'm sanding down to the surface of the timber, but obviously not below that. We don't want to dig into the timber and create new pores. I've started with 180, then 240, and finished with 320 grit paper. Okay, so our next step is to start scraping the binding and removing some of the residue of the finish. If you've got a scuffle blade like this, just use a file or something like that, grab it and lean it about 10 degrees and just drag it through, or push it through. What this does is create a nice burr on the far edge, and when we drag that across the binding, it does a much cleaner job of removing the residue. Now the idea is just to line it with the edge of the guitar like so, and just very carefully start scraping off the binding. It's a job that requires a little bit of patience. It certainly will take you a little while, but what I've found is it does a very tidy job. As you can start to see that white line really starting to pop out now. Okay, so I've got the guitar back on the bench now. As you can see, I've scraped all the binding and we've got that nice white contrasting line around the body of the guitar. I've sanded everything down to 600 grit and given everything a good clean off, brushed it and then wiped it with a damp rag. So next we'll be ready to apply an oil finish. Okay, so we'll start oiling the body. I'm just using a tung oil, which you can generally get at most hardware stores, places like that, and just start rubbing it in. So we're just applying our second coat now. What I'd like to do now is just do one final coat of buffing oil on top. Once you've got good coverage, just let that sit for about 15 minutes and then come away and wipe any excess, just while it's still tacky. So what you're doing is just wiping away the oil that hasn't absorbed into the timber. Okay, so the body's now dry. I'm just going to go through and oil up the back of the neck. Next, I've given it a sanding down with some steel wool. Now, steel wool, I just apply in a circular motion like this, and what it will do is it tends to remove a lot of the shine from the finish, but don't worry too much about that, because the next step will be doing a polish with some car polish and buffing compound of some sort, and it tends to bring that shine right back. The last step, generally when it comes to finishing guitars with an all finish, is just using some basic automotive polish and rubbing that into the timber. This is just the way to remove any remaining scratch marks left over from any of your abrasives, and gives it a nice nice polished look. To really work it in. And then using a second clean rag, start removing. It's starting to shine up a little bit already. I'll probably go over this a couple of times, so I'll stop the camera now. Just finished the final polish. As you can see, there's a lot more going on with that top now. So from here, what we'll be doing is installing our hardware and electronics, and then doing a setup on the guitar so it plays well. So we'll pop the guitar back up on the bench and we'll start talking about installing hardware. Always want to drill pilot holes when we're using small screws like this. The reason being, unless you drill a pilot hole first and make it a little bit easier for the screw to go in, you're running a risk of stripping the screws. So obviously never use a power drill for installing these tiny screws in the hardware either. So the next item we'll be installing will be our strap buttons. So strap buttons, again, as the name implies, are the buttons for our straps. So on an LP style guitar like this, you normally have one inserted at the bottom of the guitar, and one just in the center of the upper bout. So typically find center line across the body, mark down using a set square or something like that. Now again, obviously drill a pilot hole using a 5/64 inch or similar drill bit, and then with the strap buttons themselves, in your packaging you'll generally find it assembled like this. So you'll have a small rubber padding that sits under the button like so. The screw goes through and it should look like that. Then we'll install. In your packaging you'll find the 4 bushings. One of them, generally the bushing on this side nearest the F hole, also contains an earth wire. So before you put this in place, it's very important that you find the earth wire in your packaging. It would generally be a black coated PVC coated wire. You need to, if it's not already, strip the end off a little bit, feather the wires out. The wires basically need to sit hard against the outside of this bushing. So what I would normally do, as you can see the wire's already in place here, you'll notice a small hole in the side of one of these holes for the bushing. So you'll thread that earth wire through, and then feather out the individual wires at the end here, and then you'll
install this bushing while keeping that that wire hard up against it. So basically it's able to earth out on the bushing itself. So the last piece of hardware we want to install are our tuning pegs. Just make sure you've got your tuners ready to go, and just hand tighten for now. That's really all you need to do. Okay, so I'm just hand tightening these so they're a little bit easier to keep in place. As you can see, I've already drilled the pilot holes here, but again, same process as before. Just come along with a smaller drill bit and drill your pilot holes. Now, what I like to do, just using a steel ruler, it's just to ensure the alignment's correct on these. They should all align nicely. And once you've got those in place, just come along again with a small tool or something like that, and quickly mark and then drill your pilot holes. So as I said, these pilot holes are already in place, so I'm just going to drill these, just going to screw these small screws in place. So now that the tuners are in place, I'll just come along with my socket here and just hand tighten those. And that's pretty much our hardware installed. When it comes to soldering, there's a few basic things you're going to need, obviously. A soldering iron, some solder, and I'd also keep a damp sponge and some water you can spray on that, just to clean off the tip of your soldering iron every now and then. So if you've never soldered before, a couple of things just to keep in mind. You should always keep the tip of your soldering iron tinned. So you can see I've got a covering here of solder. That stops the tip from oxidizing. Otherwise, what will happen is the solder will have trouble sticking to your iron and makes it difficult to make your connections. And we also need to tin our wires and also the lugs we're connecting to on the components. The other thing to remember about solder, it's not like gluing two objects together. What we're really trying to do is transfer heat. So the soldering iron's very hot, the solder sticks to that. So the lugs that we connect the wire to and the wire itself will need to heat up first. So I'd always leave the iron against the component first for a little while before feeding just a small amount of solder in to make the connection. Alright, so we have to get this pickup selector through the pickup selector hole. So what I've found is the best way to do this is to take a guitar string, tie a length of fishing line through the ball end of the guitar string, protect the edges of the hole with some tape, and just run that through into the channel. And hold on to the fishing line and just pull that back out. And then what we can do is tie this fishing line through the hole there. When you tie this off, tie the knot well above the selector switch itself, so when we're pulling it up the line through the hole, the knot will not pull the pickup selector to the side. We want it to be coming straight up. Okay. If that was loose fitting there, I'd suggest holding onto the line until you can secure it some other way before you can get a washer on there. But that's in there nice and tight, so we don't have that concern. Okay, so just thumb tighten that for now. So I'm going to run these wires through now. We can't pull these straight into the holes yet. We are going to need to hook up our pickup wires to them. Okay, so now we can install our pickups. So you'll have an obvious neck and an obvious bridge pickup. The smaller pickup ring obviously goes to the front, and the pole pieces face outward. So this would be our layout. So next I'm just going to poke those holes through the channel as well. Make sure, if you're unsure, highest side at the back, and the pickup wire should be in the corner. Okay, so the last wires we need to connect are our pickup wires from our neck and our bridge. So remembering our neck was a red wire, what we want to do is put the hot wire coming out of the red lead into the input lug of the volume pot for the neck. So I've got these laid out in this template here, but that's how essentially they'll be fed in. So you can imagine them facing up the other way. So this will be our neck volume, neck tone, bridge volume, bridge tone. So a neck pickup will be ground to the back of this pot here like so. And the hot wire will go onto this first lug here. So if the pot's facing you, it will be the lug on the left. Also have to connect this earth wire at some point as well, so we may as well do that now. And that's the earth wire coming from against the bushing of our bridge. Remove the fishing line because unfortunately the fishing line won't attach very well to those pots. So you're better off using cotton for those, or something a little bit finer. I guess a fine fishing line would also work. Okay, from there we can throw in our volume and tone knobs. Let us press on. And the last thing we need to do is just hook up our input jack. The input jack's already been pulled through. I used the fishing line and guitar string method. So this nut here stays on in place. The plate then goes over like so, and it simply screws on like so.
Okay, so now we've got our hardware installed and our electronics all connected up. The last thing we want to do is just a basic final setup. So I'm going to go through setting the correct amount of neck relief, adjusting the action of the guitar, so this is the string height from the fretboard, checking and then adjusting the intonation, and lastly we'll check and adjust the pickup height. Now a lot of these things you may want to come back and revisit after you're more accustomed to the guitar, after you played it for a little while. So consider these starting points really. Okay, so the first thing we do whenever we're doing a setup is tune the guitar. We want to make sure the correct amount of tension's on the neck before we make any changes. Okay, so once that's done, we just want to check the neck relief. So you can do this a couple of ways. You can use a steel rule. You can use feeler gauges under that to check the exact measurements. Probably a more intuitive way to do that though is just to fret at the first fret, the last fret, and then just tap down on the 12th fret. Now if that string's laying flat, which this is, I'd want to increase the amount of relief, and that increases the amount of forward bow in the neck, which would then help with clearance of those frets. If on the other hand the action was too high, I'd want to tighten the truss rod, which would take tension out of the neck and flatten the fretboard out. So the way to adjust the truss rod, first just remove the base screw from your truss rod cover. And just push that out of the way. There'll be an Allen key for adjusting your truss rod. In your packaging, it'll probably be in the same packaging as your cable. And as I said, I want to introduce more relief to this neck, so I'm going to loosen the truss rod. To loosen the truss rod, I'm going to turn it counterclockwise. Obviously, if I wanted to flatten the neck out, I'd be turning it clockwise, and that would be tightening the truss rod. So just turn about 1/8 of a turn to start with. You don't really want to make major adjustments each time, so just work incrementally and just check again. So that's increased the amount of relief there a little. Okay, so you can see we're actually pressing down that string now. There's a little bit of room there to move. So I'm just going to create a little bit more relief by just doing another quarter turn. Okay, and that's good. So that's what you do there. You just keep making those adjustments until you're happy. Now the next thing we want to check is the action, which is the distance the strings are up from the fretboard. Now action's fairly subjective. It's really up to you. It's subjective, as I said, but if you're not sure, a good starting point is to aim for 2.4 mil on the low E and 1.6 on the high E, and measure those at the 12th fret. So you can use a steel rule, or in this case I'm going to use a string action ruler. Now it's important to remember when you're measuring this, you're measuring from the top of the fret to the underside of the string. So this one's pretty close, I would say. But if I did want to adjust that action, I'd make that adjustment at the bridge. So as you can see, I'm raising the action by turning that counterclockwise. So if I want to lower the action, I'd be tightening it. And tightening it will put the post further into the bushing, and that will lower the action. Okay, so that's got us back to pretty much where we started, so that's good. Okay, so second last thing I should say I want to check is the intonation. And that's really just checking the guitar's in tune with itself. Now, just quickly, if we have a look at this bridge, you'll see it's on an angle, it's got a slight compensation, and that's to compensate for the additional mass of these strings. And that's really what we're doing when we're fine tuning the intonation like this. So first, just make sure we're in tune again. Okay, so when we're checking intonation, we're essentially wanting to make sure the guitar's in tune with itself. So if I play the open string, that's an E. Now I also want to be able to get an E at the 12th fret, which is an octave up. So also want to get the same note an octave up. So as you can see, that's just a little sharp. I just want to hit that with the same amount of attack as well. So you can see the open string's just a little flat. Again, now these are new strings, so probably should have stretched them out a little first to get to take some of the slackness out of the strings. But hopefully we'll be okay here. So again, just with the same amount of action or the same force on the string, you see we're just a little sharp. Not too bad, but just a little bit sharp. So the way to make minor adjustments like that is to adjust the intonation adjustment screws, and they're located just on the inside of the bridge. So you need a flat nose screwdriver, a small one. As I said, we're a little sharp, so I want to increase the length of the string. To do that, I would turn counterclockwise, which would push that saddle a little further back. And that just increases the distance the string can vibrate. So its first point of contact is the nut, second point of contact is the saddle. So if we push that saddle further back, we're just increasing the length or the scale length of that string slightly. So if you see now, I've just overcorrected a little. So I'd need to bring that saddle closer to the front just to get that right. Now you would do that across all your strings and just fine tune until everything's intonated well. The very last thing I would check is the pickup height. Now pickup height again is subjective. It really depends on what you're hearing to some extent. But if you're not sure or you're looking for just a starting point, I would aim for 2.4mm clearance on the bass side and about 2mm clearance on the treble side. But it's not quite that simple. We need to hold the string down at the last fret. And we also want to measure from the top of the individual pole pieces to the underside of the string. So as I said, 2.4mm. So the pickup's a little high there. So the way to adjust that is just to adjust the mounting screws. So as I said, I'm just going to bring that down a little. So counterclockwise to lower the height of the pickup. And again, just hold them down at the last fret. I could still come down a little further. And that's pretty much spot on now. But again, that's going to be subjective, so a lot of that will depend on how the guitar sounds to you. So that's really it. That's a basic final setup. As I said, you may want to come back and repeat some of these steps after you've become more accustomed to the neck especially. And that's really the process. So from here, we're going to plug the guitar in and test the guitar. Unfortunately, I'm left-handed, so it's going to be a little hard for me to do a full demonstration of this guitar. But we will just run through the different pickup settings and just test everything's working correctly. Okay, so I'm in treble position now. We can hear our volumes rolling off. Our tones rolling off. Okay, middle position now, which is a combination of both pickups. And our final position. So everything appears to be working well. So the next thing I would do to test the guitar, pop the pickup selector in the middle position and turn the volume up to 10 on both. and just take your hands away from the guitar. Now you should hear no signs of hum at all, so no electrical interference. If you do hear any hum or any interference, it probably means there's an issue with your ground circuit. So the black wires that we installed in a circuit that we're connecting up all the different components and then connecting to the bridge, you may find one of the connections has gotten loose. So it would pay just to check that first. Okay, and the last thing I would check is just the neck itself. I would play each individual fret and so on, all the way up the neck on each string. What you're listening for there are any dead notes or any signs of fret buzz. Now if you did come across any problems, you would put the guitar back up on the bench and you would check your action and check the amount of neck relief you have. Okay, so that's the end of the build. I hope you've enjoyed building your guitar as much as I have. Thanks for watching.